microphone's not working, so
My good friend, the timekeeper. Yeah.
All right, hello everyone.
Hello.
We're kind of running behind schedule. I know probably some of you have questions for everybody, so I'll try to go through this fast, but there is a bit of information to go through. Who is familiar with Global 30 program? All right, good number. So basically, Go Global Japan was a program emphasizing Japanese students going to study abroad in foreign countries. This is the reverse. This is a program that was attracting students from all other countries, I guess, in Japan, to study. It is finished. It was from 2009 to 2014, and I'll explain a little bit about what exactly happened. Before we start, a little bit of background. So this is a graph showing 18-year-olds in Japan. Blue being general population, green high school graduation, yellow university entrance, and red junior college entrance. As you can see, Japan is at a point where they're reaching parity with the number of students who want to go to university and the number of places available at universities. And in the near future, it is expected that schools will struggle to find enough students to fill out, especially smaller private schools. So there is an issue where schools they must attract students from elsewhere, either through continuing education, night programs for adults, or possibly through international students. As well, a little bit of background. Although there are national universities that do receive a fairly large chunk of funding from MEX, the national government, Japan is very stingy when it comes to funding tertiary education on the whole. The sector is dominated by private universities, which receive no funding, and the state universities don't receive as much as they should probably, especially as a share of their GDP. So when there's a chance for funding from the government, schools get very competitive trying to seek that. Historically, with Nakasone, Prime Minister Nakasone in the 1980s, this became the first push for internationalization or globalization of Japan's education sector, trying to attract more students, establish world-class universities, which I'll explain a little bit, and with the Koizumi 30 world-class universities, and then Prime Minister Fukuda was the Prime Minister which started the Global 30 project. Basically, Global 30 wanted to establish 30 universities which would be hubs for international students in Japan with the goal of eventually attracting 300,000 students by the year 2020. So that was the overall goal. Now, as Dr. Fenton said, there is a difference between globalization and internationalization, which I kind of contest, and I use that to establish if these are successes or failures. The situation in Japan now is, I believe, a globalization one. The schools are internationalizing in order to strengthen Japan's economy, establish human resources, both Japanese and international students, and strengthen the education sector as a business, I think. So you can see there's a quote from a MEX minister. We want to establish human resources, which I kind of shift towards globalization rather than internationalization. So, Yonezawa, researcher in 2009, sent out a survey to almost all universities, and he got a really, really high response rate. There's about 730 so universities when this happened. So, what do you feel about internationalization from the presidents of various schools? And the highest responses correlate to human resources, economic competition, exporting Japanese, culture and products. This is what internationalization means to these presidents. However, when we go to more cooperation, international, gathering of students and kind of learning from each other, the kind of desire of that is much, much lower. So we can kind of see that there is more of an emphasis on building the economy rather than, sharing cultures between Japanese and international students. So, looking at MEX documents, these are the stated goals of Global 30. They want to establish degree programs in English at various schools. They want to establish recruitment offices in other countries to attract students. They want to have 20% international students by 2020. or 10%. They immediately quantify, oh, if they don't get 20, oh, that's all right, 10% is fine. The same thing with the faculty. They shoot for 10%, but yeah, you know what, we'll take 5%, whatever. So these were the goals at the outset. These are quite ambitious goals, but I think they were largely misguided in terms of what I believe internationalization should be. So what I think they should have thought about before they set this up. Where are our international students coming from? What are they studying? What do they want to do after graduation? And you know, what is their goal for their career? Like, if we're going to provide education, it should be targeted towards not the university's desire, but the desire of the students who are coming to study. Everyone okay so far? Going quite fast. So, selection process. This is how they decided which schools to choose for this program. The first 2 points, you know, really focus on strong research schools, right? The top schools in the country in terms of research. A lot of grants and a lot of postgraduate degrees. That's the goal. The last 3 focus on just students or schools with large student bodies. 300 plus international students from 50 different countries, and then large international faculty members. Now, I think these were very arbitrarily created, and these numbers kind of just imagined to self-select the schools that were already considered. If we look at 2008, when this program started, 10 of the top 20 schools in terms of student population were selected. Meiji and Sophia were much less, and Doshisha, which was eventually selected, isn't even on the top 30 JASO released list. So, yeah, we have some very good schools, but schools that were, I think, overlooked for selection based on your guess is as good as mine. As well, from the announcement of Global 30 to the deadline for application to the evaluation to the publication of successful applicants took 2 months. That should be a huge red flag for anybody who thinks that this was a serious program. I really do believe MEXT had 13 schools in mind that they were going to select and fit their selection criteria to get those schools. So, 13 schools, 7 national and 6 private, kind of the usual suspects when we're thinking of the best schools in Japan. No state schools, and really no schools that are kind of, I think, famous. Akita International University had just been established a few years earlier, so they weren't selected. Ritsumeikan APU was not selected, even though they had the largest international student body. Some kind of unusual choices here. So, 2008, everything's looking great. And then the financial crash happens, and austerity kicks in. So, they were going for 30 schools, but they stopped the program at 13. They started cutting the budget really heavily in 2009, 2010, and then eventually in 2014, they stopped the project altogether. So, the schools would receive about 200 to 400 million yen per year for each year, and they can kind of decide what to do as long as they're hitting the goals MEXT set up. So I'm going to skip to the results. I'm going to skip ahead to 2014 and see if they were successful. So, in terms of the 13 schools that were selected, yes, they did attract more international students than they had before. That can be considered a success. But I like to think about this in a little bit larger terms. And when we look at the overall international student numbers in Japan, they're fairly flat overall. So this is total international student numbers at higher education, and then broken down into 4-year schools. I think that is technical or seimongako, graduate schools, and so on. Now, MEXT tried to cook the books with this a little bit, in that they publish in about 2012, they start counting students at Japanese language schools as international students. And they're like, oh hey, look how many students we got now. And it shoots way up if you count those students. But I don't think they're actually part of most of these Global 30 initiative programs that were established. So, I consider this a failure. So, where are the students coming from? In 2008, Vast majority are from Asia and East Asia, China, Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, and so on. So, recruitment centers, where do they establish them? Russia, Tunisia, India, Uzbekistan, Egypt, Germany. Okay, countries that aren't exactly sending a ton of students to Japan. Not sure why they chose their schools. Each school must establish one recruitment center in another country. They can do multiple ones, but almost none of these countries received a recruitment center. And if we look at the changing enrollment, Vietnam and Nepal go crazy in the last few years. I have no idea why. I haven't really done any research about that. But for some reason, Vietnam and Nepal are now number 2 and 3 to China in terms of sending international students to Japan. Totally not involved in Global 30 whatsoever, I think. As well, when you think about what the students are studying, I think the assumption is that technology, engineering, science, these are Japan's strong points. However, from JASO data, majority of students are studying humanities and social sciences. Okay? So again, if we look at the numbers through the years, humanities and social sciences are by far the most popular degree choices for international students. So, what degrees were established in English? Predominantly engineering degrees. So, humanities and social science get about 130 degrees between each other. Engineering doubles that number by itself. As you can see, the schools aren't exactly looking at student needs for what they're thinking about in terms of establishing English language degrees. So, I consider that also a failure. School rankings are very, I don't think they're worth much, but they're very important for many of the government and school officials. Every single school involved in Global 30 dropped in rankings between 2008 and 2014. Every single one. They had some little jumps, but if you compare year on year, oh, and this is Times Higher Education. They don't publish their data before 2011, and the QS rankings that are a little bit newer don't rank a lot of the schools involved at all. So, I also consider this a failure. Here are the private schools, also dropped. If you look at the criteria that these things use, international staff, international students get by far the lowest scores. Citations, employee review, peer review, those are fairly high. But in terms of international students and staff, their scores are really quite low. And if we look at TH rankings this year, Japan only has 2 schools in the top 20 of Asia. They're really getting blown out by China, Hong Kong, Singapore, Korea. They're not in good position right now in terms of international hub of education. Now, how am I doing on time? Okay. So, all of these points, attracting more students, developing human resources, increasing status of schools, these all follow internationalization as I think of globalization. This is internationalization as neoliberal economics, right? Competition as internationalization. And I think this misses the point of internationalizing completely, right? Schools are internationalizing as a means to an end, to be competitive, and not actually honest about trying to internationalize the students themselves. So, bunch of quotes, if you care, maybe not. So, if we're thinking internationalization as more of a individual identity formation thing, I think there's much different kind of criteria we need to think about. Before, I think Global 30 failed as a neoliberal economic experiment. That was unexpected. I think they wanted to succeed. These are the expected failures. International student body. We have English language degree programs and we have Japanese language degree programs, and never shall they meet, right? They're really isolated and separated at many of these schools. The classes exist separately, the dorms exist separately. JASO actually publishes international students' housing choices. So we have private, so like finding their own apartment, international dorms set up by the school, general dorms set up by the school, so this would be mixed dorms, and then international housing set up by a local government, I guess. They just say public. I'm not sure what they mean by that.
See.
So, as we look through the years, more and more students going to international dorms, very few, or just kind of steady at general dorms. So, separation of international and general student body. Okay, couldn't find a lot of good data about this. I have not been able to do my own case study, and Global 30 is finished, so it's hard to find students who were involved. But the English degree programs largely are taught by the same Japanese professors who are involved in the Japanese language programs, just in English. I'm not sure how they select if they're qualified to teach in English or not, but they say, hey, Dr. So-and-so, you've got a engineering class on Thursdays in English. Good luck. And I've watched YouTube videos, which I don't think are academically sourceable, but people kind of complaining about the quality of the education they receive in some of these programs as being less than stellar. Many of these international students in the MEX documents themselves, and I think in an underlying way, are considered to be temporary visitors to Japan. They're expected to get their degree and go home. This might be kind of an economic thing, right? With a lot of Japanese companies need points of contact in these countries, China, Vietnam, Thailand, but they're not expected to stay. And the only real data I could find was a Yomiuri Shimbun survey that said of 11,000 international students, most from Asia, 30% found jobs in Japan, but that's half of the number that wanted to find a job in Japan. So, they're establishing recruitment centers, they're establishing dormitories. I don't know where the career centers are in this equation, but they seem to be lacking. So, Global 30 finished in 2014, largely due to budget cuts. And it kind of evolved into the Super Global University Project, which is similar and different. I think this is a much better thought out program, but it suffers from some of the same problems. There are many of the same schools involved, many more schools, and these much better reflects the actual student numbers. This is from Wikipedia, if you want to just search it. But they have 2 tracks in terms of how global are these universities. And they have a much wider mix of national, prefectural, private universities that I think is better reflective. However, if we look at the A-track schools, when we look at university rankings, they still rank very low in terms of international student and staff numbers. So it's still an ongoing process. So my own personal recommendations, we need to have April and September intake for all programs if we're trying to be international. We need to have students be able to take courses in both Japanese and English if they so choose. Japanese students taking English courses, international students taking Japanese courses, and getting the same degree. It should not be separated. Promotion of additional language courses or medium of instruction in additional languages. There's no reason not to include Chinese when we're getting 70% Chinese students. Student facilities should not be separated based on international Japanese status. They should be integrated and offer services in both languages together. And as well, hiring of more faculty to teach in both Japanese or English or others, and this should be done jointly. There should not be this is where the English teachers sit and this is the other teachers. It should be, whenever possible, combined. All right, let's go on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for fascinating presentations. There are probably many questions, and we have only about 20 minutes to talk about the presentation, so you're welcome to ask questions to all presenters.
Yes.
I wasn't quite sure about the job finding business. If you go to the internet and search in Japanese, there are all sorts of agencies offering to match up graduates of Japanese universities with employers. And in the articles in the Nihon Keizai Shimbun, there are all sorts of references, particularly to medium of the Chisho Kigyo types in Kansai being particularly desirous of employing foreign graduates of Japanese universities, although I don't think they're looking for people who've graduated from English language programs. They're looking for people who've graduated from Japanese language programs. Also, a comment on the segregation. I was back in where I taught for a number of years, University of Sheffield, and I noticed in Sheffield there are dormitories